So I'm going to talk to you about a part of the work that we're doing in my lab. My lab is fairly interdisciplinary. We work on a number of different things. This one is one of them, and this is trying to understand how we could get to something like this. I would suspect that most of you have seen this. Raise your hand if you don't know what this is. Okay. I'm looking around. I was looking in particular for people that are younger than this gentleman here, because this is iconic. This is the HAL 9000 computer. HAL stands for Heuristically Programmed Algorithmic Computer, and it was supposed to have become operationally on January 12, 1997 at the HAL laboratories in Urbana, Illinois. It is, of course, the computer that ends up wreaking all kinds of havoc on the crew of the spaceship in 2001: A Space Odyssey. And just to date myself, I saw that movie, as a 6-year-old, live, and I think it did something to me because I didn't really remember anything, but these images of these streaming stuff somehow, left in my brain. Much later, I saw it again, but it was, a fairly profound experience to me. So it's sort of the prototype of what we want when we think that we're going to make intelligent machines. Not only is this an intelligent machine, it's also a mischievous, machine with grudges, right? So in movies, we're used to this stuff. We see them all the time. Some of them look like that. I don't even know what movie that is from. But these are sort of our quintessential ones. This, I believe, is from the Arnold Schwarzenegger movie. What was it? Terminator, that's right. This one is called AI and has a little boy who would like to be a human and sort of delves into the kind of questions, ethical questions about robotics, and that's, of course, iRobot, I think it's called, and again, a machine that clearly thinks the way do...
I have a quick question.
Yeah.
Why is it that every AI talk has to start with Hollywood movies?
Well, to some extent, it is the iconic thing of what we think we ought to have, and we're in a sense used to these images. Yet what we have is this, right? So intelligent robot. I don't even know what that is. But that's the Aibo, and that's the Asimo, that's the Roomba. These are some soccer-playing robots. If you've ever seen an actual movie, not the movie that they give you to sort of sell this, but the outtakes, this isn't really that good a robot in the end. And the most successful robot of all time is this guy. Okay, there's about 12 million robots, in the world today. 11 million of them are Roombas. Tells us something about where we are today. So we have, of course, computers that play chess. So here's the iconic scene of Garry Kasparov walking away dejectedly after he was beaten by Deep Blue. And we have Watson, who plays Jeopardy fairly, convincingly. Here's a scene of being applauded by Ken Jennings and after having won. So we have this, but and we have, of course, the self-driving cars, right? In fact, this guy comes from here, right? Stanford was the one who won the challenge, and of course, Sebastian now is working, with Google, not with Stanford anymore. And in fact, from an engineering point of view, these are quite exceptional achievements. The amount of processing that is going on there is really quite astronomical, and I can assure you it's a lot more than is going on in our brains from the point of view of bits per second being processed. So, where does this put us? So first of all, what I would like to say is that playing chess and Jeopardy are really not intelligence. What this is special purpose knowledge, using some fairly fancy algorithmic, underpinnings in terms of Bayesian inference and other machine learning algorithms. But as far as we understand, this is not intelligence. It's really brute force with heuristics. So Google's car has car driving intelligence. There's no doubt about that. But you shouldn't ask it about chess or Jeopardy, nor would you think that you're going to put IBM's Watson at the helm of the car? Okay, this is not going to happen. Everybody knows that it's not going to happen. Yet, when it comes to this kind of cross-disciplinary tasks, we obviously do this all the time. So, and in fact, even animals, not that they're driving cars, but if you're asking them to solve problems that they have never seen before, they can do that. That's because the kind of intelligence that, that we have and that animals have is unlike the kind of intelligence, even the most sophisticated engineering approaches that are demonstrated here. So where are these intelligent machines that we have been promised, and why don't we have them? And it's not like the engineers of today's don't know what they're doing, okay? And it's been, 50 years of research, but somehow, somewhere, there's something that we haven't done, because after all, like here we are, and in fact, even in the animal kingdom, intelligence at some level is ubiquitous. So what have we missed? Well, let's go a little bit historically, and that is always very fun if I talk in AI departments, because they just roll their eyes when I show them that. So first I show them a picture of the 1956 Dartmouth Summer Research Project where all of AI started. No, this is not a picture of them. This is the 50-year anniversary reunion. But it was these people, McCarthy, Marvin Minsky, Claude Shannon, and Nick Rochester. Most of them are dead, of course. Here is a picture of Joe McCarthy and Marvin Minsky. He is the only one still alive. And he is going to feature prominently in the kind of quotes that were available shortly after the AI field really began. So in 58, Herb Simon, Alan Newell said that within 10 years a digital computer will be the world's chess champion. Now, we do had a digital computer being a chess champion, but it was not within 10 years. And within 10 years, optimistically, we will have a computer discover and prove an important new mathematical theorem, which is also not true. We've had computers make discovery in mathematics, in numerical mathematics, that's for sure, but purely by brute force search, not by reasoning. So shortly later, Herb Simon said machines will be capable within 20 years of doing any work a man can do. Clearly not a woman's work, it must be a man's work, but this was 1965 after all. In 1967, Marvin Minsky said, within a generation, the problem of creating artificial intelligence will substantially be solved, and then in from 3 to 8 years, so you get the drift, right? So this, this wasn't obviously happening. So I'm going to try to convince you that I know why, okay? And then when you understand why, then I'm going to suggest to you how we're going to go about doing it in a different way. This talk, after all, is called A New Path, not I'm going to try the old path again.
Just a footnote on one. So in the late 70s, Ken Thompson correctly predicted how long it would take to beat the world chess champion. And
Ken Thompson was the guy who programmed C?
Yeah, inventor of Unix.
Oh, Unix. Yeah. Well, C first, then Unix. Okay. Well, Ken is a smart guy. He's not with us anymore, right?
I think he is.
Okay. Well, then the other guy. There was Thompson, and I have the book on my shelf that dates me also. Who's the other guy that developed Unix? Ritchie. I think Ritchie's dead. All right. I'm going to tell you about two types of intelligence. And because I'm a very creative guy, I call them type 1 and type 2. Type 1 is behave appropriately given the environment. Okay? Basically, it says have all the answers already and have rules that you're going to be acting upon there, like if X, then Y. Okay? These are the kind of machines that essentially work on that paradigm. Okay? And whenever I put on the picture of the ant and there's an entomologist and he goes like, well, my ants, they're really much more sophisticated than that. All right, look, there is a gradation between the two types, okay, and I'm going to present you the extremes. Of course, there are things in the middle, and maybe the ant, has moved a little bit away from the Roomba type of behavior towards the type 2 intelligence that I'm going to be talking about. Type 2 intelligence, we reason about the environment. We can understand We can predict and we plan. And that's the kind of things that do that. Okay? So obviously what we want is type 2. Because type 1 intelligence, I can assure you, we know how to do that. Okay? Type 2 intelligence, not so much. So the real question then is, what's the difference between the two? So let me talk to you a little bit more about this type 1 intelligence that can be achieved by what I call reactive machines. In fact, I'm not the only one who calls them reactive machines. I'm sure I stole it from somewhere. This is a typical reactive machine. It's called in the literature the Breitenberg vehicle, after Valentin Breitenberg, who wrote a book called Vehicles. And it works in a very simple way. You see, here's a light source, and it has light sensors, and they are coupled to the wheels. And in fact, it's an activating light source. So since this sensor gets a little bit more light than that one, it drives this wheel a little bit stronger than the opposing wheel. And as a consequence, that vehicle is going to move towards the light. And then lo and behold, we see, well, it has a purpose. It loves light, right? But, from an engineering point of view, it's really just an input-output mapping, of the simplest kind. Here's another one. Here, in fact, is one. That's the same one with cross-coupled. Here, in fact, they're directly coupled. So this one is the explorer, but it goes away from the light and looks in the dark places. People do like to make up these type of stories from watching simple behaviors. And there's actually a good evolutionary reason why we do that, but never mind that. Here, another version of it where, in fact, the coupling is antagonistic now and not activating. So in these reactive machines, the actions are directly influenced by what the agent perceives in its senses. Okay, so it's much more like maybe you think of it as like a camera. There is no thinking that is going on. It is a direct action based on what appears in your senses. We, by the way, in our brains have such pathways still. Here is, in fact, a brain, and for those who are computer scientists, I have an arrow pointing toward it. Here is the visual cortex, and as you all know, because the brain is so intelligently designed, it's not where the eyes are. It's just on the other side, so you have to send the signal all the way through. And here up there is what is known as the dorsal stream of information processing in the brain. Not just the human brain, macaque brains and the primate brains are like that too. It's also known as the WARE pathway. And what it does is it connects the visual information coming from here directly to the motor neurons, which are about there. Okay? So think of it that it's the kind of pathway that gets activated if a rock would be falling on me, which is not happening because I'm obviously in an auditorium, but if I was, then I would sort of see it and then jump to the side. But I would not immediately know what it was that was falling down. It's a different pathway that handles that. It's a second pathway, and it's the dorsal stream. That's the dorsal stream that we talked about. It's the ventral stream, also known as the Watt pathway. Goes in a very different way. Not in the motor neuron area here, but in fact here in the other part of the cortex. What it does, it's involved in recognition and uses memory, and neuroscientists have been discussing this and measuring this for decades. So what does the ventral pathway do? It attempts to classify the sensory information. So after I jumped away from that rock, what I would do then is just like, well, what was that? Oh, it was a rock. And it fell from above. So if a rock falls once, perhaps it might fall again, so maybe I should move away from that area. That's the kind of processing that goes on in the ventral pathway. It is a much slower pathway because you have to access memory and you have to process, the information that you already have. But obviously, having that kind of a pathway is going to be good for survival because, in fact, it allowed you to not just recognize but put into context and plan. So this basically is, what is this? Have I seen it before? How should I react? The Watt pathway, as I just said, is much slower than the WARE pathway, and all of that is, anatomics and neuroscience that I'm not involved in. I just read that from the literature. It is, however, also much more recent from an evolutionary point of view than the wear pathway, as you can imagine. But it's great to have a wear pathway because, if a rock falls, you don't want to have a long deliberation about, about geology with yourself. You need to save yourself very quickly, and you have to do that without recognizing anything. So it's good to have both of these pathways. But they are very distinct in the way they process information. So what the neuroscientists are telling me is that the WAF pathway is involved in long-term stored representations. That's the sentence that they write. And in order to tell you what that means, I'm going to tell you a little bit about the concept of representations, because I'm going to tell you it is absolutely crucial and essential in the distinction between type 1 and type 2 intelligence. So, what are representations? So a representation is something that stands in for something else. You can think of it as a caricature or a model. It is something that captures the essence of the real thing without being the real thing itself. So here's a picture of a representation. It's a famous painting by one of my favorite artists, René Magritte, because I was born in the same town that he was born, and I used to go to the museum all the time where they have these pictures. It's a picture, and the title is Ceci n'est pas une pipe, which, of course, as we all know, says this is not a pipe. And of course, if you're 12, it goes like, of course it is a pipe. No, it's not. It's a representation of a pipe. It's not three-dimensional, it's flat. It is standing in for a pipe. And the pipe and the representation of the pipe aren't the same thing. And that's because René Magritte was an intellectual. He was trying to get that point across. Okay? But I think it's sort of useful for us too. A representation is not the thing itself. It has some of the characteristics. It is useful for us in order to think about a pipe in this case, but it is not a pipe. So representations are internal models of the world that intelligent agents can use to make sense of the world. So now I've pushed you right back into the world of intelligent agents. Basically, it is having this ability to have these internal models that allows you to make predictions about the future. You can sort of run it through your head and say, what if I did this? What would happen? To plan actions. So, people have known this for a long time. Yes, intelligent agents need to have representations. So let's program representations into computers. Turns out that is very, very difficult. In fact, it is so difficult that a lot of people simply gave up. We can't do this. And the reason is very simple. I mean, worlds are complex. If you don't capture every essence of the world, well, the robot is going to make some very silly assumption that is going to get it killed. So the successful AI from the 70s, for example, were in environments that were perfectly and utterly well known. Like spheres and things that you could move around. And there, in fact, the agents could have representations of that. But you go outside of that and nothing works anymore. So perhaps the leading roboticist of the time in the 90s wrote an article, well-known article called Intelligence Without Representation, where he argued that, let's do away with this representation. Since we can't program them, we can make machines that don't need them. Basically he said, let's use embodied robotics, okay? Situated embodied agents, I'll tell you in a second what that is. Basically, there's robots, the world will be their representation. In other words, they will take their clues from the world. They don't have to take the clues from the internal model since we don't know how to program them. And of course, what that means is you get that. And incidentally, sometime after he wrote this paper, he founded a company called iRobot, and he was the one who gave us the Roomba. So what are situated embodied agents? So in evolutionary robotics, agents interact with the environment via physical sensors, and they are, as a consequence, situated in the world. They perceive the world only through their senses. And just imagine that this is the feedback loop. So here are the sensors. They get their signal from the environment. They send the signal to the controller. The controller is, in a sense, the brain. The brain makes a decision, sends a signal to the motor, to the actuators, which then move the robot, which will make, of course, the world as it appears in the sensors change. And as a consequence, the actions of the robots are constantly this cycle that you have in embodied sensing. In other words, the way it perceives the world is determined by its own actions and how the sensors are situated on its body. And that's, essentially what these things are. So what Rodney Brooks was trying to convince us when he said we can have intelligence without representations is, we can build our robots like we built the Roomba, okay? And that's, to some extent, still what people are trying to do. Now, it turns out that in the intelligence systems that we know, the representations of the world were not designed or programmed, no matter what some of segments of the population would like to tell you. How did they get there? Well, they get there by two mechanisms, and one important one is this one. It's evolution. Many of the representations that we have, in fact, are instinctual. We are actually born with them. And the rest of them, as I will tell you, they will be learned. What really evolves is the capacity to have these internal models, to be able to build them up during your lifetime so that you can use them for the planning and the prediction part that gives us our fitness. Now, evolutionary robotics is a field which attempts to create bodies as well as brains via Darwinian evolution. And because I don't have that much time, I focus mostly on that. If I have the brain part, well, Nicholas used to do both, but he will tell you how hard that is. So in order to sort of save time, I'm concentrating on brains and evolving those. So the question I'm posing to you is, can evolution create intelligence? And when I say that, I mean, again, because we know, of course, that it did, and it did several times over. So from an engineer's point of view, if I know that there is an algorithm that will produce what I want, why would I not use it? But it turns out that there aren't that many people who are trying to do that. So I'll tell you how I'm going to try to do that, and I'm not going to do that in the standard way people have been doing that with, for example, artificial neural networks. I designed a new computational platform for that, and they are called Markov brains or Markov networks, and they are networks of what I like to call hidden Markov gates, and I also call them stochastic logic gates, and they're very simple things, so you will understand what they are. And what I'm going to show you is that we will be able to evolve representations in them. The thing that makes the difference between type 1 and type 2 intelligence. So what are these? They are networks of stochastic logic gate. A logic gate, of course, is easy to understand. It's defined by an input-output table. So here's a very simple one, an AND gate that produces an output, and it's defined by this logic table that you all know. If I have no or zeros or falses going into one input or both inputs, then the output is false unless both of them begin out as true. And of course we can have the zeros and ones stand for the false and for the true. I can also write the same exact logic table by writing here the probability that this output is a 1. It looks just like this column. Now it's not, it's a probability, so it's a deterministic gate. So only if these two inputs are on will this output be on, and its output is likelihood 1. But if I can write down probabilities that are 0 and 1, I could write down arbitrary probabilities here. They're just a different type of logic gate. In fact, it's called a fuzzy logic gate. And here I have a simple fuzzy logic gate with 2 inputs and 2 outputs. And here is its probabilistic table, and there's some probabilities that are not 1 and some others that are 1. And here the rules are very simple. If I, for example, get an input of 2 zeros, then half the time I'm going to have a 0 on one of the outputs and a 1 on the other output. On the other half, it's going to be the other way around. Okay, so that's how the computation goes. But if I get a 1 0 on the input, well then with 100% probability I'm going to get the output 1 0. Okay, so that's how it would work. But generally speaking, I can put any probabilities in there as long as they sum to 1 on a row, right? So that's how my gates work, and that's how they do all their processing. And it's really a probabilistic finite state machine, if you want to get mathematical about it. These stochastic logic gates produce outputs stochastically as a function of inputs, and then very quickly answer the question, can they have memory? Now, it's a very interesting question. I could talk for an hour on memory. Computers, it's very easy to have memory. You write a number somewhere and it stays there. Why? Because there's a voltage that makes sure it does. In our brains, it's not like that. So first of all, if you have a neuron firing, that neuron will, in a sense, not remember whether it just fired or not. It just returns to the 0 state. That's it. So this signal, this 1, is now somewhere else. Okay. If you want to retain a signal, you're going to have to somehow feed it back. Okay. So we are going to, anytime one of our logic variables, fires and is a 1, and the next time step is guaranteed to return to 0, unless somebody else writes something into it. So that way, there is no cheap memory. If you're going to retain a symbol, you're going to have to work at it and basically evolve like a gate that is writing the output right back into the input so that you can remember it. We have these in electronics, they're called J gates, for example. So in terms of Markov gates, if they do that, they're called hidden Markov gates, and that's why we're calling that. So because they can have memory, in principle. So, in fact, these machines can learn too. We have implemented a learning algorithm via reinforcement learning. In fact, my postdoc at the time did it, and he invented it and didn't realize what he did. And I realized, looking at it, that somebody must have invented it. And 10 years later, I found the name for it. It's called the multiplicative weight update algorithm, also known as the most powerful algorithm in all of computer science. It turns out there's a really interesting paper that shows that. All you have to do is Google for MWUA. So that's good. The way it works, actually, I don't have a slide how it works, but basically it's that reinforcement changes these probabilities in the table and increases them if you did something good and decreases them if you did something bad. So during learning, what you find is that representations form in memory that are built upon those representations that have already evolved, because we have evolution shaping probabilities on the one hand and then learning shaping them on the other hand. But how do we evolve Markov networks? It's actually also very simple, but it's a few slides here that I have to get through. And for those people who have not used genetic algorithms a lot, it's maybe not very intuitive. I mean, in genetic algorithms, it's a problem-solving technique where you have a population of possible solutions, and you rank them based on how well they did, and those that did the best basically get to have more babies in the next generation. Okay, and then over time, those that do really well essentially have the entire population, and then among those, if there are variations that you introduce every next generation that do even better, then they will have the more offspring, and so on. So it's basically using the process of evolution to find good solutions. Okay, and that's, by the way, what shaped your genes, just in the way we're going to do this here. So we're going to encode the connectivity of the network as well as the logic of all of these gates into genes. And then we're going to express the genes. That means we're going to build the brain based on how it should be connected and what kind of logic should be going on. And then we're going to test how well the thing does in driving a car, for example. And those genes that did it best, they're going to get more babies, meaning offspring information that then gets mutated again. So we evolve the genes. We do not evolve the network. Can't really evolve networks. That's just not something you can do. We know how to evolve genes. So how do we encode it? So here I give you an example. This is an example of a brain that has 12 neurons. Okay? And that's the state of the neurons at time t. And the thing that governs how our brain works is how does this state, which are binary, by the way, change from one time point to the next. Everything I'm doing right now is my brain, my neurons, basically, from a state of not firing, next time point are going to be firing. But why and how? That's all encoded in how the transition is done, and it's done by these hidden Markov gates. This one is a 3-input, 2-output gate. Okay, this one here is a 2 and 2. We have many more than 2, in our simulations. Certainly there's many more in your brain. There's some politicians where I'm not so certain about it, but they're mostly from the other party. So, and we encode the connectivity and the logic of each one of these in these genes. Okay, that's really all we have to do, because there's always be 12 neurons, and there's always be time t and t plus 1. Okay, so here we have 2 genes. Here's the 2 genes that I'm talking about. They're just strings of numbers, and I'm translating these numbers into what they mean. And so first, basically, I have these 2 loci that say a gene is starting. Okay, so that's what is known as a start codon. And then for gene 1, the first 2 numbers say, okay, I'm going to read from 3 things, and I'm going to write into two things. Okay, and then it's going to say, where are you going to be reading from? I'm going to read from this neuron, and neuron number 6. Okay, and I'm going to write to 6, and I'm going to write to 7. And he goes like, oh, wow, look, it reads from 6 and writes to 6. So this could already be working as a memory if necessary. Because if there's a value that needs to be persistent, it could do that. And then after that come all the probabilities that you have to put there. For 3 times 2, there's like 8 times 4, 32 probabilities that would have to be encoded in here. And we just basically coarse grain them so that they can fit into 255 bins. And we'll do the same thing with the second gene. Okay. And then you can also interpret what you got in terms of a sort of a causal diagram. For example, 0 can influence 7, and it can influence 6. You see, 6 has an arrow to itself because 6 influences itself. That's how you recognize memory neurons. 7 also writes to 11, but you see, for example, that 7, does not write into 6 because there's no direct connection. Even though, of course, there might be indirect connections. Okay, so using multiple time steps. So when we write neural network diagrams, they'll be like this. Just because there's an arrow doesn't, of course, mean exactly how the computation is done, or even if the interaction is interesting, but it's potentially there. So now I'm going to have to show you whether this stuff works at all. Okay, and I'll give you the first experiment we did, and we have basically a brain that is going to control this robot. Okay, this robot has 6 sensors. The sensors are triangles. It has 2 actuators. That's their wheels, and it has 4 brain neurons. Because some people don't need more than 4. So these here are, in a sense, the retina. Okay, that's the visual stuff that they see. These are proximity sensors. They know whether they bumped against the wall. And that's a door sensor that I'm going to explain to you. It's very important here. So the wheel actuators, for example, it's like if both of them are at 0, then the thing stops. If both of them are at 1, it moves forward. If one of them is 1 and the other 0, it moves either left or right. And the task it needs to solve is it needs to get through this maze. In fact, the maze is much longer. I'll just show you the beginning of it. Okay? And the only trouble is that if you don't know where the door is, to your right or the left, then you might take a long time to get through this maze. Okay? So we're giving it this information, this, where the next door is going to be. And this information is going to go, so if the door next door is on the left, it'll show a left, right? It's been inputted into this door sensor. Of course, the brain has no idea what this is and might not even connect to it, because remember, connecting to a neuron is something that is determined by evolution. But the worst of the part is that when it steps out of the door, that information is erased, because I told you we do not have persistent signals. So for this agent to solve this task, it needs to evolve memory, where it will keep this bit in the brain. So let me show you movies of how this works. So this is starting from a completely random brain, meaning, this string of digits is complete gibberish. Okay. If you put this on a robot, it will simply sit there and do nothing. You can imagine that, right? This is what happened after 2,000 generations of evolution. By the way, let me stop this for a second. Oops, that's not how you stop it. What you see down here are these gates. Okay, so here is a 4 output, 3 input gate. So it's a 8 times 4 table, and what you see there is essentially which one of these fires. Remember, I told you that depending, it's a probabilistic gate, but when a signal comes in, then which of those fires is determined probabilistically, and it tells you which one fires. So this is not a large number of gates, but this is the brain, and to some extent you're witnessing the firing pattern that is going to be controlling this robot. And you see what it does is it sort of like jitters left and right. That's all it figured out to do. Except it knows one thing. Watch. If it stands in front of a door, bam, it runs through. That's really the only thing it knows. It knows if all my 3 front sensors say 0, 0, 0, no door, move. And then it just tries to jitter until that happens. Well, that works. That's 2,000 generations of evolution. Here's what happens after 14,000 generations of evolution. It's a bigger brain. And you see, instead of jittering, it really purposefully moves in one direction, in a sense knowing if I move, there'll be a hole. Okay? And if it bounces against the wall, it sort of immediately comes back rather than going like, you know what, I'm stuck. But it clearly has no idea where the door is going to be. It's a 50-50 thing. Okay? So it doesn't have any memory yet. Here is 49,000 generations. An even more complex brain. And watch. Very obviously, this guy knows what this door sensor is, and it knows how to make sense of it. And we can watch this a little while, and you will see that if it runs through this again, which it does now, it doesn't always follow the same exact path because, it has probabilistic gates. However, the probabilities are all fairly close to 0 and 1 if they're being utilized at all. But sometimes, it seems to make up its own mind what to do. So I always tell people that we evolved free will right there. So here is sort of like the fitness trajectory, over time. This is the point where vision and contact sensor evolution utilization evolved. That's where door sensor utilization evolved. And the only reason why they're not 100% in fitness is because they are stochastic. And evolution has a very hard time making exact probabilities of 1 and 0. And in fact, in another experiment that I'm going to show you, we determined that we shouldn't even use stochastic logic gate. We're going to use deterministic logic gates. So in other words, purely logical Boolean logic gates sometimes work better. And if I draw the causal diagram between these neurons, this is in fact what happens. Out of the 4 brain neurons, it only needed 1. And that thing here tells you that in fact it has memory. And it's this memory, of course, it gets the information from the door sensor, and it influences the actuators, the wheels. You even see that it tries to remember the state of one of its wheel sensors, because it turns out if you know that, you can remember the direction of your motion. Because remember, when they move, it's either 0 or 1. So you really only need to remember one of them to know whether you're moving left or right. So it can use this information to change its direction if necessary, because it uses this proprioception, essentially, to sort of, it's like, oh, am I moving left or am I moving right? And nobody designed this, okay? This is a highly efficient architecture that essentially operates optimally in this environment, and no human design was involved. So that's very nice, but I tell you that the brains that I evolve have representations. Can you prove that? And that's what I'm going to try to do. So if we can claim that we can evolve representations in these brains, and maybe better than in other computational attempts, then I have to show this. And we did this in this paper that came out a couple of years ago. So the task that we investigated there was a different one. In fact, it required quite a bit more memory. The task there is in a world where you have small and large blocks, and they can move diagonally in both of the things. This is the agent. It has a visual system that has a blind spot, and it needs to catch the small blocks, and it needs to avoid the large blocks. And the problem there is, first of all, you have to move in order to make the distinction between the small and large blocks, because the small and large blocks, if they are just overlapping this, they look the same. And on top of that, I need to predict where it's going to go. So I need to sort of keep in mind one time spot and the next, and then predict where it's going to be, and then plan my action in such a way that I'm going to either intercept it or not intercept it. So that's a fairly complex task. And here is an agent that does this. And just to, make that story short, that is not a designed agent. This agent actually solves the task 100% accurately. From any configuration that we're throwing blocks at it, it will always do it correctly. And now I'm going to try to tell you how we measure the kind of internal model that this agent has in its brain about the task that needs to be achieved. So we're going to define now representation mathematically, because otherwise we will not be able to measure it. So a representation is information about the world that is stored within the brain that goes beyond the image of the world depicted within the senses. Okay? Because a picture of the world is not a representation. It is, in a sense, yes, it is perhaps, if it's a camera picture, it's not the actual world. But in fact, it is also not a model of the world, because it's just, there is no interpretation going on. Okay? Obviously, also, if it is not stored, it cannot be manipulated and thought about. Okay? And a picture, in a sense, cannot. So in order to mathematically define that, we need to define information about the world that is not already visible in the senses. Okay? So representations, are things that I can think about with my eyes closed. That's the thing, right? If you need to look at it in order to make decisions about it, then it is not a representation. If you can think about it with the eyes closed, then you're talking about representations. So here's how we do that in information theory land, and you don't have to have been, a PhD in information theory to know what this is. We're basically defining with these circles what we know as uncertainties about here, the environment or the world. This is the uncertainty about the states in the brain, and this is the uncertainty associated with the states of the senses. Information that the brain has about the world is the intersection between, the states of the brain and the state of the world. This is sort of like, if they're correlated, then they're in here. Okay. Here, this is the intersection between the brain and what it sees in the senses, and this would be the intersection between the world states and how they are depicted in the senses. And representation is what the brain knows about the world, but that is not in the senses. So in other words, this piece, is what is in the brain about the world, but it's also depicted in the senses. So we're taking it out. You cannot look at the senses. It has to be, what you know about the world needs to be in the brain. It cannot be in the senses. This stuff, all that stuff is in senses. This stuff isn't even in the world. You can have stuff in the senses that's not in the world. It's noise for you. So we can define what that is. It is what the brain knows about the world with eyes closed. Okay? So, but we can measure this. Okay. So, but in order to measure this, we have to actually classify the states of the world. And you might think, well, that's a crazy thing to do. But in this simple world, it's actually not that difficult. Except the total world is actually fairly complex. So we decided we're going to coarse grain the world. There's only 4 variables that really describe what is essentially or potentially important for the agent. It is whether or not a sensor is activated. That's one variable, E0. Whether there's a block to the left or to the right. That's the second variable. Whether a block is small or large, third variable. And whether the block is moving left or moving right. So these are the 4 essential, you can call them atomic concepts. And they obviously describe a world that can have possibly 4 bits. The real world, it turns out, can have that many states. You can count them. You can just, figure out how many states there are. Not 4 bits of entry, but 10.6. But not all of these bits are important. So we characterize 4 simply because we can. It's easy to characterize. And then we just measure correlations between states of the world and states of the brain as they appear to us in neural recordings. You can do that with rats, by the way. It's just more complex. Here I show you what happens as we evolve the brains over time. And this is, in fact, the average, something like 100 runs, independent runs. So that's why it looks so smooth. The real evolutionary trajectories do not look smooth. And we're showing how the fitness increases. Okay. We also compared it here to how the fitness would increase if it would be using, artificial neural networks that many of you are familiar with. By the way, I'm going to tell you later, they're already not standard artificial neural networks. We already gave them somewhat of a advantage because the real artificial neural networks that we first used, they were doing really horribly, and one referee said, "Well, you can do better than that," so we did. Here is how R, our measure of representation, goes. It goes up, essentially just like fitness. There's a very, very strong correlation between representation and fitness. What we actually did is we made artificial neural networks whose connectivity can change. Because the standard neural networks are every neuron connects to everyone. And from a neurobiological point of view, that's just craziness. Okay. Neural networks are really very sparse. And indeed, they're doing much better if you allow for connectivity. But still, they don't do as well in representation and they don't do as well in fitness. All right, fine, you're telling me. They can represent. Here I'm telling you they represent. They don't represent a ton of information. Up to the best ones probably represent up to a bit of information. But it's sufficient for them to actually make their decisions. But how do they work? Well, let's take a look. So here is the agent. It turns out that, so here are the actuators, here are the wheels, okay, and here are the internals. We gave it, 10 internal neurons because we thought, maybe you'll need that many. Turns out they didn't need that many. These 4 neurons, they didn't even bother connecting them to anything. Okay, so they were completely inert. Because remember, these brains evolve, so we got to just look at what they do. And here is the wiring diagram. So if you can understand what that means, that's great, but I can't. One of the things to keep in mind is that we have these logic gates, and they create these edges, okay? But the world is constantly changing, and in a sense, these gates have to do a different computation at every point in time. You don't get to change the program, depending on what you just did. It's like, well, now it's 3 ticks later. Use a different program. It's the same gates that that do a completely different behavior 4 ticks later than they did before, simply because they can, and that's somehow reflected in this weird, pattern of how things are connected. This is in fact a brain that has perfect fitness, but there is no way I can tell you how it works. You've seen it at work. The video that you show is this brain controlling the agent. So we figured, okay, so these actually are gates that are digital logic, okay? So if we just write down what the ones and zeros are in the probability table, I ought to be able to write a Boolean logic expression that tells me how that thing works. And you can actually throw this into a program called Logic Friday, which tells you the most condensed logic expression of this. All right, let's do that. Here it is. This is the logic. You cannot, this program cannot, compress it anymore. And in fact, I looked at it, I couldn't either. And so you see, this is not how we design our logic networks. There is just inputs from absolutely everywhere. And how am I going to control what the state of this thing is? It obviously is using its own state at the previous time. This is the state of the neuron at the time t0, and this is the state of the neuron at time t1. It's just incomprehensible. So we've realized that evolved brains are perhaps impossible to understand from the point of view of how we understand computation. And in hindsight, we should have expected this. Why? Because if human understandability is not an issue, then the most concise representation of anything is the most compressed one. And compressed representations, by definition, have no way in which we can, tell anything apart. If there was something that, look, I can see something here, well, then you could compress it some more. If something is completely compressed, then in fact it looks completely structureless. And that's how these representations look. So that's what we should have expected. So the conclusions of this part is that representations are internal models of the world that make it possible to make decisions using states other than senses, You're making decisions based on your internal states and on memory. How they encode these representations, I can't tell you, but they do. We're measuring them, and they're making the decisions based on things they're using sensors too, of course, but they can make decisions with their eyes closed too. How much information and which concepts are represented can be measured. I have another set of slides that I cut out because I know this would have been too long, where we can actually measure representation about which concept, about the left and right concept, about the left of the small and large, and in which neuron are these concepts stored. And the answer is, the short answer, they don't use the atomic concept. They're using mixtures, smeared concepts, and these are represented not in single neurons, but smeared over a bunch of neurons. Not all, but groups of neurons. And there's more to be said about that. So you can spend a year analyzing these networks from an information theoretic point of view and figuring out where is the information stored, where does it flow. So in evolved brains, that's a short answer. Concepts are complex and they overlap. So what is this new path now that I've been talking to you about? So the path is the one charted by evolution. So here is the baby depiction of the process, how you go from simple life, even though I assure you that fish down there isn't anything but simple. But the path, in a sense, is the one going from simple animal behavior towards complex animal behavior. So in other words, what we want to do is we want to start by evolving brains that can control robots like simple animals would, and then figure out how you can evolve them more and more and more so that you can, in a sense, move up this chain from simple decision making and simple internal models to more complex internal models and therefore complex decision making. Now, everything I told you was evolution inside of the computer, because that's where you make evolution. After all, I don't have 1,000 robots that and robots don't get babies, right? If they did, we wouldn't be talking. So, how can these brains work in real machines? Because after all, I don't think artificial intelligence is going to be useful for you if it's on a computer. So here I show you how we intend to do this. This is, in fact, a Markov brain controlling a robot that does a very simple thing. All it does, it needs to stay in this painted circle. Okay? And the algorithm, by the way, is very simple. We do much more complex things than that. And here it shows you basically which sensors are activated, and then basically, that's a very simple thing. It figures out which are activated, and based on that, it does a rotation movement. It stays within the circle. But we can take this exact brain, and then we can transplant it into that thing, which, I don't know what that is, a Pololu robot with a Markov brain attached to it. And you see, we just painted a circle on a white board and let it go. We did nothing, no tweaking, absolutely nothing. It works perfectly well. Even though you see that the geometry of the circle is very different from the one that it was used to in its life in the computer. But the evolutionary process usually makes fairly robust algorithms. So the transplant process, at least for these instinctual behaviors, is fairly simple. We did a few others. Here's one, in fact, from the same student, Tassio Pinto. This one evolved to actually follow any track, any black track. And we gave it one that has this edge. I wish I had the movie. I have to ask Tassio to give it to me. It turns out it can't really deal with this sharp edge. It confuses the senses. But you know what it does when it comes off of it? It just makes a turn and goes right back on. And he goes, like, why did it do that? And nobody programmed this. And the answer is, you see, when in the evolution phase, we don't show it just one track. It has to do a lot. And if you lose your way, you're dead. You do not get to have any offspring. So anybody who's still alive, well, they know how to deal with when you get off of track. So it is very robust to these type of things because it had to in the thousands of generations when that program was sort of going through its paces. We did a few other ones just to see if you could evolve grouping behavior. Here the fitness was, if you find another robot, stay close to it. And, all of these things are massively limited by how much money you have to buy, fancy computers, and we don't. I'm sure Stanford has way better capacities than we have. And that would be great to use things like that. I'm trying to raise money to buy real stuff, trust me. But these were basically brains, again, evolved in the computer, transplanted on the robot, and they do behave just fine. So where is the future? Well, what we want to do is we want to evolve progressively larger brains using progressively more complex tasks and, as a consequence, progressively more complex fitness landscapes. We want to, on the one hand, of course, generate fundamental knowledge about how behavior and intelligent algorithms arise and what kind of strategies evolve. But we're not beyond also generating applied knowledge and using this technology to actually do something interesting. So we, for example, are using it to understand image diagnostic, time series prediction, because these are Markov brains, they are prediction machines. And, if you evolve to be the better predictor, you have a higher fitness. So we, using this, we're doing sunspot prediction and things like that. So our goal is to evolve a brain that is sufficiently complex that it can control a physical robot well enough for it to explore the world on its own and learn. So what that means is, the goal here is we're going to evolve a brain that can learn, and we're going to evolve it inside of the computer. And then we're going to transplant into a fairly sophisticated mobile platform that requires money. In fact, we're going to transplant it onto 3 of them. It requires 3 times as much money. But the idea is, the moment you transplant these brains, what you have is you have babies. Okay, you have newborns. They have a brain that has instinctual behavior. It can control this robot. And possibly we've evolved, in a sense of curiosity. But it really doesn't know anything about the real world, that it just opens its eyes in, okay? But because of the learning algorithm, it can start to build representations about the world which is, in which it finds itself. But it will take time, lots and lots of exploration to slowly build this up. But think about it. When you were born, you were no better than any of these robots. You had the capacity to build up these representations that you have now, but you don't have them at the time. It takes 10 or 15 years for you to have any interesting thoughts. So, and the interesting thing, now that we transplanted the same brain onto 3 robots and we follow them for 10 years, we can sort of look at, everybody will now have different representations. Why? Because they see different things. Because they can't be in the same place. So they will have different personalities, no doubt about it. And then we can ask, well, I've been asked, so what have we really gained? Because it takes 15 years to get an intelligent brain. Well, like my adolescent, has that too. Well, what you have gained is, if you kill that robot, you can make a copy of its brain. You can make as many copies as you want. You can't do that with your adolescent. So, in a sense, this investment, first, the probably decade of evolution, and then the decade of learning, well, that's time well spent. Because, if one of these robots should die in a horrible mind-fixing accident, it doesn't matter, because you have a backup copy, and you can evolve it further if necessary. Yes, there will be ethical discussions to be had, but we'll get there. But, I have been to these discussions where people are saying, the threat of artificial intelligence and wiping out all of humanity, how are you going to react to it? And says, look, it's not that simple. First of all, those people who make these arguments, they have never actually tried to make an intelligent machines. Because if they did, they wouldn't be talking like that. It is extraordinarily hard. Those people who did try, like Rodney Brooks certainly tried very hard. He will tell you this is hogwash. The path that I'm telling you about is not a path where I'm flipping a switch and the agent says, oh, and I'm now your overlord, go away. It's not like that. Because they start as infants. Now, during the time, and by the way, they have to interact with the world and learn about it at roughly the same pace as we do. They can't suck up all of the world's knowledge. That's not how brains representations are formed. In the computer, the AI just, sucks into some sort of conduit and knows all about the terrible wars that we did and then concludes that we're not worth saving, right? It's like every movie that you know. It doesn't work like that. Representations are formed slowly. They're built on each other. You can't learn about Hamlet without having learned what human behavior is. And you learn that, when you take the crayon of the other kid in play school. Okay? So it is going to be a slow process no matter what. And these robots, they can't rush through the world and pick up all this stuff. But they will. They can when we're done with it. And it might take 20 years. But you will have an AI. It may not be as sophisticated as ours today, but it should be very obvious to anybody interacting with it that it is unlike the Google self-driving car and unlike the IBM Watson, because it knows about the world. But it knows about the world because it lived in the world. This kind of intelligence is going to be contextual. But I think it's still going to be extremely valuable to have it. So we're going to be evolving progressively larger brains using progressively complex landscapes. I already said that. I want to thank the people that helped me with this. First of all, my former postdoc, now professor in integral biology at Michigan State University, Arend Hinze. He's essentially co-constructed or designed this Markov brain technology with me. He's the one who invented the learning algorithm. And then a bunch of students and postdocs. Many of them have already moved on. Randy just graduated. He worked mostly on understanding animal behavior like swarming and evolving Markov brains for agents that swarm. Tassio is still with me. He's doing the robotic stuff. Masood is going to be graduating. He did many of the time series prediction. Dave has a faculty position doing, I guess, machine learning. And Sam moved on to a different university. And I guess I'm going to need a new crop of people to help me out. In fact, I'm building a new institute at Michigan State University which as its main goal is to basically create this artificial intelligent thing using the process of evolution. It's very expensive, so I'm fundraising. Once we have the money, I'm going to be hiring. And you'll all probably get an email announcement about it at some point. But I think it's a very exciting thing. The way I describe it to my students is one day somebody will have, created artificial intelligence. Do you want to be on the team that watches this, or do you want to be on the team that makes it happen? So basically, I'm telling you guys the same thing, and well, thank you for your attention. All right, I'm sure we'll have some questions.
In the rock catcher and rock invader, for example, once it starts moving in a particular direction, it's deterministic.
Yeah, in fact, the blocks are moving deterministically.
If in fact you made those movements more uncertain, it can change directions on the way down. Or if you train it deterministically and then put it in an environment where the behavior changes.
So
how
what that
well do these systems, in a sense, you evolve a deterministic logic. How robust do they turn out?
So it's a good question. We haven't done that. We have done something else. So first of all, the answer will be you need a more complex brain to be able to do what you just described, because it's a cognitively harder task. Obviously, just from information theoretic point of view, that you expanded the number of states that you're going to have to consider. What we have done is we have taken that particular task and made large number of variations, okay, to see if it is a more complex task, whether the brain that evolves is in fact going to be more complex. And we have mathematical measures for brain complexity. And we did in particular another experiment. We took brains where we would hamper them, like we take away one eye, okay? So in other words, the sensors are going to be hampered. And what we see is that more complex brains evolve in order to deal with the missing sensory information. So it basically is trying to offload that stuff into internal states so that it can still, it won't be able to get as high a fitness. But in order to compensate, the compensation is going to be in more cognitively complex, traits.
Because it has to have some memory.
Yeah. So there's a paper that was published last year out of University of Wisconsin, which are collaborators. I think I'm a co-author on it also. So it's a much more elaborate analysis of this task where you have, 3 different types of blocks instead of 2, and things like that. And may even have, I don't think changing directions like you suggested, but all kinds of variations to see, how is the difficulty of task reflected in the complexity of the cognitive processing that is going on. Yeah.
So in your model, evolution creates the brain, and then all that happens after that is representations build up?
Yeah, all of that. After that, in a sense, the connectivity of the brain cannot change anymore.
I know, but human brains change all the time.
So they do change. The connectivity changes. I wouldn't say all the time.
Well, synapses are forming and dissolving continuously.
Well, so the question is, how many and what time scale? So look, you're right. Okay, And I think this may one day be an important element to have. I don't think this is sort of going to be important right now. I could be wrong, of course. So we don't have that at this point. In fact, it's algorithmically much harder to do this because I only have to change the probability in the learning part. You know, the way the connections are set with us is genetically. I don't have a way to recode, you know, in a sense, phenotypically. You know, this is somatic, so to speak, not genetic. So my current stance is that we don't have enough evidence that this process is crucial in understanding intelligence. And as long as we have no evidence for it, we're not going to touch it. And that could change, of course.
Maybe I misunderstand. Do the probabilities change?
They change. They change through learning, yeah. It's a reinforcement learning. Basically, remember you saw the 0.5...
computer, but not when it's actually solving the problem.
No, as it solves the problem. No, well, if learning is turned on. You know, in the thing that you've seen, there was no need of learning. The world doesn't change. Learning is important when the world changes. Therefore, if you would be evolving, the world doesn't change. There's no learning that's going to ever evolve. It's absolutely not necessary. It's when the time scale of changes are fast enough that the genes cannot keep up with it fast enough. Okay? So when you're asking what kind of environment is necessary in order to have this kind of complex learning, first of all, a changing environment. An environment that requires predictions to be made quickly. And predictions that can't be done in a simple manner. So very often, in the brains that you evolve, they're trying to offload cognitive processing to the environment. So for example, instead of thinking about something, they're going to find a feature of the environment that is predictive about something to happen. Okay? It's called offloading. It's a very well-known thing in psychology. So you have to design a world where that doesn't work. But even better, you have to design a world that changes in a causal manner, because otherwise you can't possibly predict things. Everything's about prediction. But in fact, where the changes can't trivially predict it, like if there's a sine wave, okay, predicting it in the next time point means I can predict it to infinity. So what kind of a world is complex and unpredictable, but not completely unpredictable? Well, the answer is it's a world in which you are, but also other things like you, where your survival depends on predicting how another organism's brain works. Because if I can do that, well then I can survive. But that, of course, requires that I understand how, in a sense, my own brain works. Because in the end, that's the shortcut. I know that if I would see this, then I would do that. And I'm thinking that the organism is like me, so I'm going to predict it's going to run that way. And after all, that's how we work all the time. So, in order to evolve the kind of intelligence we're talking about, you have to do it in worlds in which there's other agents just like them, which is computationally very hard to do, because rather than simulating a world with falling blocks or walls, you got to simulate a world in which there are, in fact, other such agents with their brains and their behaviors. But, as I say, it's just computer time. Right? Go ahead.
So you use the reinforcement learning in your experiment. So do you think it's an advantage of it, or other learning algorithm can also be used?
Probably other. I don't want to get into, this is a huge discussion about in the learning field. Q learning, T learning, but trust me, reinforcement learning is the only way to go. It is fast. It's really astonishing. I tell you an experiment that we did. We have a robot. It needs to go to a dark area, okay? And I have a clicker in which I give it a reinforcement signal. The clicker is good robot, or bad robot, okay? And you give it a Markov brain with probabilities where it goes to dark, okay? And you see it doing, and then just a click. And the robot goes like, what? You see this, and goes like, well, according to my probability table, this was the thing to do, click. And it stops doing that, okay? And what's going on is that the probabilities that made it go to dark, which is just a comparison between use and the senses, goes like, no, down. And if you push one of the probabilities down, the other ones in the row go up. And so suddenly, it starts moving towards the white. And you click the good robot. It takes 5 and 6 clicks, and it's over. The brain is completely transformed, and instead of moving to dark, it moves to light. Reinforcement learning, because a change of one probability affects all the other probabilities in the same pathway, is a very fast way. And in fact, There's a paper which shows it is the most efficient, the multiplicative weight update algorithm, which is in fact reinforcement learning. I can show mathematically that they are identical, is the most efficient algorithm. In fact, Darwinian evolution is in the same class, it turns out. Yeah.
So I noticed that in one of your slides you had a number of new logic gates, Markov logic gates. And then you showed a slide where there was only one of the gates active. In other words, it looked like there was a different number of gates
Well,
the
so
system had evolved to.
was it the videos?
It was one of your network diagrams, and you said, well, actually, we didn't use these other gates. They never even got.
Oh, so these were neurons that they weren't using.
Or neurons.
Yeah.
So it would seem that there's an evolution from a high entropy state to a low entropy state.
So
Is that correct to think
no,
about?
in fact, evolution goes in different directions. So first, if you look at the entropy of the neurons, it starts at zero entropy because it's not connected to everything. So all these neurons, except for the sensor neurons, they are on. They're not really neurons. They're just recording the information and sending that signal out. But those that can change, they start order zero and stay at zero. And then they start getting inputs. And then the entropy becomes high. Because it might not make any sense. And it's then when they become, in a sense, more cognitively attuned that the entropy drops again, because in fact, then the randomness is never good, right? So in a sense, the entropy first goes up and then it goes down, and then it probably stays at a constant level that is the optimal level for the kind of information processing that needs to be done.
Do you have any general observations on patterns in that development, or?
No, we never looked at that, in fact.
Okay.
It's actually a good question. You could ask even, whether we can see things that occur in brain development rather than brain evolution, because we know, of course, that a majority of the connections of the brain are formed very early during in the first 3 months, in fact, of an infant's lifetime. Wouldn't be great if we could at the same time record from these brains, but it's ethically questionable.
Excuse me.
Yeah.
I'm sure you must have read the Demis Hassabis paper from Nature with the DeepMind paper. Can you compare your system to
Yeah, I can.
the DeepMind system?
First of all, I like Demis. Okay. He's a very smart guy.
Now worth $600 million.
Really, you made a company with it?
Oh yes, and the company was bought.
Was it bought by Google, right?
Bought by Google.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Maybe I should hook up with him again. Because, here's the thing, okay? Deep learning or deep, whatever they call that thing that they did, which is deep behavior, whatever you want to call it. Right,
learning mixed with-
playing Atari games.
Yeah.
That's not intelligence. And I'm not the only one saying it. It's still machine learning and lookup. Okay? There is no cognitively complex processing going on in there. I know how these things work. Okay, there are hierarchies of fully connected neural networks. They're using backpropagation to train. It's fiendishly difficult because on the 7th layer of their hierarchy, the errors are of the order of 10 to the minus 12, and it really stretches, the computer's ability to do that. So they're going to graphical processing units. The big advance that has happened in deep learning is that people smarter than the previous generations have been able to use these type of architectures. Hinton, one of the first ones. Then all the guys like Jan LeCun, who's the guy in Germany? Schmidhuber, very good guy. But there is no there, okay? If you would be trying to measure representation in these things, it's minimal. They cannot really do any decision with their eyes closed. So it's smart technology, but it is not conducive to intelligence research. So, for example, I have a colleague, also a graduate of the MSU Beacon program. What he did is he evolved. So one of the deep learning things, big successes, is image recognition. Okay, like they show them images on the internet and goes like cats everywhere. Right? He evolved images to fool deep mind or deep learning networks. So, for example, one of the tasks is recognition of numerals. Okay, numerals that look like, I'm going the wrong direction here. Sorry. This, handwritten numerals, okay? And deep learning has solved this problem. There's 60,000 images, these are just files. There's 10,000 reserved for a test set, and deep learning essentially gets 27 of these 10,000 wrong. And you're looking at the images it gets wrong because like it doesn't even look like a number, because they were written by a bunch of different people. Some of them are chartered accountants and they look really good, and some are written by high school students after prom night. So basically they do this as well as you can. You know what the guy did? He evolved images, because he knows how to do evolution, to fool them. So he shows a picture that is just grayscale digits, just like white noise on television when we still had those. And deep learning goes, oh, it's a 7. With 99.94% accuracy, it's a 7. And you go like, what? It's not a 7. This thing knows nothing about 7ness. Nothing. It has figured out a way how to map the pixels onto a decision, and has done that extraordinarily well. But they have no concept of what they're actually seeing. And the same is true for actually images from the internet. He just generates these images. Now, so when he evolves those, of course he evolves the images to fool them. So he finds, in a sense, what they're reacting to, and they're not reacting to 7ness. Now, I do a very different thing. Of course, I want to evolve brains that can recognize these things. And then I want to ask my colleague Jeff Kloon at the University of Wyoming, you try to fool them. And you can't, I predict. You can't, because they might have visual illusions, so they might mistake a sloppily drawn 6 for a 0. Okay? But that's okay. That happens. But gray, noisy image, that shouldn't happen. And the way I'm solving this is very different. Because the big problem with this is that this image, if you move it, well, the pixels in the camera look completely different. So there is a problem of translation invariance, and rotation invariance, and scale invariance that you need to solve. And everybody working in computer vision knows this. And there's different, I know how these people solve it. Basically what they're doing is they're creating an archetype of a number, and then they are producing distortions of this and rotations, and they're using these all as possible images that you need to. So in other words, they're taking the 60,000 image database and amplifying it into a 2 million image database by even creating all of these modifications of the archetype. And I'm thinking that's not how our brain works. What I'm doing is I have a little robot that has a little camera, and it only sees a little bit of it. And it drives over the image. And it makes decisions of where to go next. And what it does, it moves the spatial recognition process into a temporal time series recognition. In other words, you have a series of things that you see, and you have to predict what comes next. And if you predict it correctly, you know what numeral you're looking at. So it's a very, very different problem. But it turns out our brain does it exactly like that. If you think that you can see this entire scene that you're looking at, you can't. You really, really can't. What your eyes have done is you know what this scene is supposed to look like, and then you do a few spot checks, and your brain reassembles the rest. But you do a saccade from things to things to things, and they're like, oh, I know what this is. That's how these brains operate too. They look at a few things, and after that they know what they're looking at, because evolution has created this expectation. And it's like recognizing a music series of notes. You hear 3 or 4 notes, and you're like, I know how this continues. So in other words, and we can drive through this from anywhere. Right? At some point, so the translation invariance is immediately solved, because at some point you're going to start seeing it, and that's when you start hearing the sounds, right, the music. And if it's rotated, it doesn't matter, because you can comment it from any direction. It already knows that. And the camera has a zoom. So, basically instead of saying that the images need to be amplified, I just simply have these transformations on the level of the camera rather than the level of the image. And that works. I mean, We still have ways to go to beat the numbers that the deep learning people have done. But they have groups of 250 people working on this day and night. And I have one grad student. So, I still make more than 27 mistakes on the 10,000 data set. But what I can see is that they, in a sense, they know what they're talking about. Okay, this is not random behavior. They're doing the spot checks and goes like, I'm going to go there. And then if it's a 5, I should be getting a spot there. If it's not, and you see the beliefs, then it's probably a 3 or an 8. We have them on the image. And then just one more check and so like, I know. 3, done. Go ahead.
Yeah, so I think these are great ideas. What's the hurdle for you in making it more mainstream? Why is one idea getting 250 people and you not?
Because there are an enormous number of variables that I need to test. And one run with one set of variables, so it turns out this is the most complex cognitive tasks that we have ever evolved brains. So I didn't realize, because these are 27 by 27 pixel images, okay? And I started out with a camera that only had 9 pixels. It looked, therefore, at less than 1% of the pixels, okay? And then, you have to have, in each run, because it takes 100,000 generations at least, sometimes I have to go to 500,000, it takes essentially a week to get the data back, okay? And then we say, oh no, we need a bigger camera. Or, I need a better way of, like if I'm sitting in the corner here, I don't want to run anywhere. I need to actually have a long-range sensor so I know that where the number is, roughly, so I can move right towards it. How many images should I be testing? 40, 100, 1,000 at a time? There is such a large number of parameters that we need to test in order to see what works. So it just needs to be done in parallel by a lot of people using a lot of computational infrastructure. As it is, it's just a factor 200 slower than what Google can do.
So I think we have time for one more question.
And that students graduated. Engineers in Google don't graduate. Yeah.
So, given that artificial neural networks can do logical operations, I'm not sure I understand why the hidden Markov gates are.
Okay, it's a great question. I got this question many times, so I'm fully prepared to answer. So there are many differences. By the way, there's some things that artificial neural networks will do better than the Markov gates. Okay, typically these are behaviors where you need to have sort of continuous gates, for example, sine type of behavior, like sine function. Artificial neural networks have continuous inputs, continuous outputs. Ours are digital logic, okay? Artificial neural networks are good at recognizing patterns, and they're doing this by storing them into a fixed point on a high-dimensional manifold. And if you change the environment slightly, it means the fixed point in the manifold moves around slightly. Everything is continuous in this world. And if that's your task, ANNs would probably do okay. Also, if the world doesn't really change a lot. What they can't do is if there's a single bit that's different, then you completely change your behavior. Because that's discontinuous. It's like, well, sometimes friend or foe, where you go or run, is a tiny bit of information. Okay? So whenever the world that you have to react to is discontinuous, it's not smooth. And in behavioral tasks, that is very often the case. Then Markov networks are better because they are logic gates. There could be, all of these variables are the same, but there's one veto bit. It's like, well, if that was on, run. And ANNs can't do that. ANNs also have the disadvantage that they're fully connected. And, that means to some extent that you can't go larger than a particular size, because at that point, this thing becomes untrainable. Deep learning has solved this by putting them in hierarchies, which is smart. You have to do that. But it again shows you that the idea of everything connects to everything is just insane. Okay, if you would be asked, describe the connectivity of our brain, the answer is almost nothing connects to anything. Okay, it's extraordinarily sparse, and it has to be. Otherwise, you get way too much interference. Having connect everything to everything means that if sending a signal, you're going to interfere with all kinds of stuff. You have to have something separate. And if you can modularize things by making sure that there are no cross connections. That's a good thing. There is in fact mathematical literature about about sparseness in networks and how important that is for decision making. So that's sort of the short story. I bet one can do a much longer story, but to some extent we don't fight that battle anymore. We know we're having the right thing because we can follow the temporal processing of information. Can't do that in neural networks because all they do is they add things into a hyperbolic tangent. Yes, you can make arbitrary logic using hyperbolic tangent, but my God, how many gates do you have to do that? We can just simply write the logic that we need into one gate. It's done. So on top of that, you can get complex logic cheaply.
Thank you very much.